Hi, it's Steve Smith here again, and welcome back to presentation number 18 this time, called 12 Principles for Language Teaching. That's my Twitter handle at the bottom there, plus my blog, FrenchTeacherNet.blogspot.com, and a reminder about InformedLanguageTeacher.com, where you'll find videos, podcasts, and readings about research relating to language teaching. Now, the thought behind this presentation, which is quite a general one, is this. It goes back to something that Gianfranco Conti and I put together in our book, The Language Teacher Toolkit from 2016. And one useful thing we thought we could do in that book was to put together some general principles for language teachers. And here, I think we're mainly talking about language teachers working in the high school sort of context, mainstream classroom teaching, as it were. The principles may apply less to other circumstances. For example, if you were a business person learning some English for a very specific purpose, let's say, or if you were in the military learning a language to be used in the field, or, for example, if you're a young child learning in an elementary school, primary school context, the principles might not apply perfectly, but I think they're still a pretty good set of principles. So let me take you through the 12 principles and just say a little bit about them. So they're from this book, The Language Teacher Toolkit. Now, our first principle was this, and I'm going to read it to you. And it's principle number 1, and I think in a way it's the most important one. So to make sure that students receive as much meaningful, stimulating second language input as possible. So to put a higher value on interesting listening and reading, including extensive reading. Although, extensive reading is going to apply more to linguists once they've got to a certain level, let's say. And a nice quotation we found from the Lightbound and Spada book, How Languages Are Learned. A key message: comprehension of meaningful language is the foundation of language acquisition. So in other words, comprehensible input is at the heart of everything. And I can't stress that too strongly, and this is why teachers are always urged to use target language as much as possible. For example, ACTFL, the American Council for the Teaching of Foreign Languages, has a target of 90% target language use for lessons. I wouldn't particularly want to put a percentage on that, but I think it does send out a strong message that target language use in the classroom is really important. Of course, there'll be plenty of times when you're not going to want to use target language. For example, giving pep talks to classes, explaining grammar, dealing with classroom behavior issues, explaining complex activities, using translation when necessary. So lots of times when you're going to use your first language, but on the whole, I think the general advice is to try and use the target language as much as possible, as long as it is understood. Second principle that we listed was to make sure that students get opportunities to practice orally. There is some feeling out there among some writers and teachers that we shouldn't be pushing students to teach too much, that we should just rely on input and allow them to communicate when they feel like it. We make the case for what's called in research pushed output, getting students to practice orally, and from the earliest stages, both in a very tightly structured, controlled sort of fashion and in a drill type language or repetitive language, chunks and patterns repeated over and over. So getting them to repeat and recycle language as much as possible. I have mentioned in a previous presentation that from cognitive psychology, we know there's something that's called the production effect or the generation effect, which is that when we say things out loud, we tend to recall them better later. They tend to leave a better trace in long-term memory. And I think getting students to use language in a non-threatening way, in an enjoyable way, will help them remember. So that was principle 2, oral practice. Our third principle was a balanced mixture of the 4 skills. I probably just want to refine that a little bit. Certainly my feeling, and I think Gianfranco Conti would agree with me on this, is that of all the 4 skills, it's listening that we would probably put first as the most natural of the skills, the key to language acquisition. the way that we pick up our first language is through lots of repeated listening of somewhat structured language. And I would personally put speaking a close second. I think when people talk about, what is knowing a language, it's, how can we converse in the language? How can we understand and speak in the language? In my order as well, I would put reading third. I think reading as a source of comprehensible input to reinforce listening and speaking. And writing as well to reinforce the other skills. And although writing is arguably afforded too much attention in examinations, perhaps for reasons of tradition, and somehow that writing is valued as serious in some way, it's also something that you can see and measure more easily. It's often a good test of accuracy. So these things which have been traditionally valued in education probably put writing on a bit of a pedestal. But it has to be said as well that we do require writing, particularly when using social media, and therefore, given also that writing supports the other skills, then there's a place for it in the classroom quite clearly. Principle 4 is about promoting independent learning outside the classroom. You've only got so much time in the classroom, and once we get students to a certain level, anything we can do that encourages them to use the language, to get input and practice outside the classroom will help. I mean, ideally, if you can get your students to spend time in the target language country, that's the biggest single boost that you can provide them with. I would suggest a study trip or an exchange. But any sort of reading and listening and practice outside the classroom will add to progress. Our principle number 5 was to do with selecting and sequencing the vocabulary and grammar you expose students to. Now, let me be clear about that. This is not really an argument for a traditional grammatical syllabus where you decide in advance precisely the order in which you're going to teach every point of grammar. I mean, there's plenty of material coming out of research to show that traditional what's called synthetic syllabus is not necessarily the best way to go, because students are developmentally ready at different points to acquire different grammatical structures, and some would even argue that students are somewhat immune to our teaching. They will tend to pick up structures in a natural order. That's certainly the case in first language acquisition, and there seems to be some evidence that it's the case in second language acquisition as well. But clearly, you're not going to randomly select and sequence vocabulary and grammar. That wouldn't make sense at all. Vocabulary will be sequenced depending on syllabus need, depending on frequency, depending on the use that students are likely to make of those words and chunks. And similarly with grammar, it's unlikely that you're going to expose students to more complex areas of grammar early on. And you can make a case for some sequencing of, for example, verb tense in the early stages. It probably makes sense to focus on present tense, which is the tense that's most often used, and which can be a simpler form of the verb, and therefore to avoid the issue of cognitive overload for students. Why would you necessarily confuse students with lots of different tenses, for example, all at one time? So there are issues there to do with cognitive load. Our 6th principle is to do with actually explaining how the language works. Now, you might be surprised that we would include this at all, because it might seem self-evident that we need to explain grammar and patterns and rules at some point. Some people make the case that really grammar isn't acquired in that way, but there's enough evidence from the research now to support the idea of explaining how the language works. But the danger is, and I think it's a very easy trap to fall into for teachers, is that you spend a lot of time explaining how the language works and imagining that just students understanding the rules means that they will be able to apply them. But that clearly isn't the case. All research and experience suggests that that's not the case. Far more important than understanding the rules of the language is to be able to put those rules into practice. So although there is support for explicit teaching and practice of rules, the key thing is for students to be using the language over and over again, getting more and more input, and that's how grammatical rules are more likely to become embedded in students' own, shall we say, mental representation of the language. It takes a while for the system of the language to become embedded in memory. Vocabulary in a way is easier, it's items that can be recalled, but the system of the language, what's called system knowledge, how grammatical rules function, is a tougher nut to crack, and you can't rush it. Principle 7, a general one, is really the focus to enhance proficiency, the ability to independently use the language promptly. And so here we're talking really about developing procedural knowledge. It kind of goes back to the previous principle. Knowing about the language is something, but knowing how to use the language is what it's really all about. And so anything we can do that helps build long-term memory and the ability to use the language creatively, to create new sentences, for example, that's what we should try to be focused on in the long run. Principle number 8, and this is one that we dwelt on in detail in our book in 2019, Breaking the Sound Barrier, where we focused on the idea particularly of teaching listening through the idea of listening as modelling, not testing, or put differently, adopting a process approach to listening rather than a comprehension or product approach to listening. And the same would go for reading as well. So the idea is that we would use listening texts and reading texts to model good language rather than to be focused on testing all the time. So in other words, can we break down the process of listening and reading into its component parts and then build it back up by doing exercises that focus on each of those elements? So for example, in the case of listening, where it's really important to be able to break down the stream of sound by understanding individual sounds, syllables, word boundaries, and so on, can we design activities that focus on that particular micro skill? So in Breaking the Sound Barrier, for example, we gave lots and lots of very specific classroom activities that would focus on the individual sub-skills involved in listening. So that's what we mean by modelling good language use, rather than just trying to test it with questions all the time. Principle 9 is about correction. Now, there's been an awful lot of research about what's called corrective feedback or negative feedback, what we would normally just call correcting. And it's rather mixed in its results, but generally speaking, there's enough evidence out there to suggest that negative feedback can improve acquisition. But much of it, whether we're talking about oral feedback or written feedback, much of it is really about how it's delivered, when it's delivered, and who it's delivered to. It's very difficult to make generalizations about this area and to say that one sort of correction is better than another. For example, you can divide correction into two categories, what's called direct corrective feedback, where you simply point out where there's a mistake and you tell the student what they should have said or written instead. Then there's what's called indirect feedback, where you might just circle written errors, for example, and ask students to find the answers themselves. Some research suggests that might be more fruitful. And then in oral corrective feedback, do you simply put the student right, or do you just use the technique of recasting, i.e. reformulating what the student said in the correct way so that they then hear the correct version? Now, there's been lots of research into this, and to be honest with you, it does give mixed results. So that's why it's hard to generalize, but it does seem generally to be useful to give some sort of negative feedback, but much depends on how it's done. Principle 10, we wanted to make mention specifically of translation, Since over the years, in some views of language teaching, translation has been looked at rather critically. As soon as you use translation, it's felt, well, you move away from the target language and encourage students to think in their first language. I think we've moved on since then, and there's clearly a good case for using translation both ways in terms of rehearsing language. It's interesting that research on the brain suggests that when we activate knowledge of the second language rather, so when we're thinking about solving a linguistic problem in the second language, we're also at the same time activating the brain's knowledge and traces of the first language as well. So in a way, you can't avoid thinking bilingually. So we can play on that. We can use the first language to help when we're developing second language skill, and translation, of course, into the first language gets students to read carefully, to listen carefully. So it was really just a plea, a reminder that we shouldn't look too critically on translation. In fact, see the very positive role that it plays in language learning. Principle 11 of the 12 was just a reference to digital technology. But again, with a caveat here, there is a risk that we resort to technology to make languages more fun, more interesting. But one danger is that then time is devoted to creating, if you like, digital artifacts, making stuff, rather than focusing on the key things we need for acquisition, which is input and practice. So I think the message here is whenever technology can help generate interesting input and opportunities to interact with it through output, then it's going to be useful. If that technology is used in a way that doesn't really give you the surrender value you need, in other words, it doesn't create that much learning, then you need to be wary of it, don't you? And our final principle was to do with culture, not surprisingly. I mean, this barely needs saying at all, I suppose, but some would even argue that one of the main reasons for learning a language is to broaden one's outlook. It's one of those unique things that doing a language in the curriculum offers, a different way of looking at the world and a way of being critical of one's own culture or cultures. It's also the case that quite clearly it's a source of motivation for many students. It's a way into the language, and it's something that many students find intrinsically interesting. So often those nice moments in lessons are when you start to talk about your own experiences as a teacher. That sort of thing can come across as much more real and authentic to students than, for example, chapters in textbooks with descriptions of different customs and so on. So I think it needs to be in there as one of the key principles, exposing students to other cultures. And of course, the term culture is problematic. There are different cultures within a country and within one's own country, of course, but I think the point is clear. So they were our 12 principles. Maybe you would have others, or you think that we omitted something. And to finish off today's session, and I just wanted to point out a couple of books to you. I made reference to Lightbound and Spada, How Languages Are Learned. I think it would be my first go-to book on the theory of learning second languages. And a more recent book that came out in 2019 by Nava and Pedrosini called Second Language Acquisition in Action. And although it's focused primarily on teaching English, what's nice about this is it gives a sort of an overview of language acquisition theories across time, but then it shows how these might apply in real contexts as they observed teachers at work, and they give samples of lessons, little extracts of exchanges between teachers and pupils. So I enjoyed that book, and it's one I could certainly recommend to you. Thank you for listening. Next session is going to be a practical pedagogy one called Dissecting a Lesson, and it's going to be focused on listening and speaking with intermediate level students. Okay, bye for now.